r/nosleep. Posted by you/saint_circa. There's something horrible in Rose Lake. As I cast my line out onto the still blue waters of Rose Lake, I couldn't help but smile. There's something about a well-placed cast that never ceases to feel good. The zing of the line. The subtle arch you could gauge with the bait on the end of your hook. The tiny splash, and little ripples that followed. It was a mundane accomplishment, sure, but an accomplishment is an accomplishment all the same. As I tightened the slack on my line, I observed the area around me. Astonished as always by the view I had here. The sun was setting and casting gorgeous glows across the lake. All around me were the rolling hills of southeast Ohio, deep green and endless. Like something out of a postcard. I laughed absent-mindedly and pondered for a moment if postcards were even a thing anymore. Or if picture messages and snaps had rendered them obsolete. As true as the nature of fishing can be. I began to follow my thoughts down whatever rabbit hole they decided to wander to. The extinction of postcards led me to thinking about how things have changed since I was young and learning how to fish. Which lead me to wonder about how the world looked when my grandfather was young and learning how to fish, and his grandfather before him. Did the settlers look at this place with the same admiration? Did the Iroquois deem this a sacred place? It was in the midst of these directionless mullings that I heard it. A faint whistling sound from somewhere across the lake. If there was anything else was going on, I'd have missed it, but with the sun setting, and the wildlife around me bedding down for the night, there was nothing to drown out the sound of it. At first, I thought that maybe it was just some kind of night bird, but as I listened more intently across the pond, I couldn't make out what kind of bird could have a call like that. I had spent my whole life out in the woods around here and had never heard any sound like this. There was an emptiness to it that I couldn't describe. It was as if someone was standing across the lake and simply whistling. Not any particular tune, no particular rhythm of any kind. Just someone making a whistling noise for the sake of making whistle noises. Probably just some tone-deaf fisherman. I tried to reassure myself. Admittedly, the presence of this invisible stranger was putting me on a nervous edge. I'd been here for several hours now and had seen no evidence of any other person fishing here. If you wanted to fish on the other side of the lake, you had to walk a good 2 miles around it to get there. The side I had set up on was the only access a vehicle would have to this place. I looked around me to verify that there were no other cars parked here that perhaps I'd missed, and saw only my truck silhouetted on the dirt road. As I looked behind me with my back facing the lake, I noticed the empty whistle becoming louder, and more discordant. What was faint and far away only a few moments ago had become indistinguishably closer to where I was standing. The sun by this point had fallen behind the mountains, and darkness shrouded over the lake, concealing any and everything on the other side. Including the source of the whistling sound that had unmistakably gotten closer. Uncomfortable nervousness was steadily replaced with a rising fear. The sound was getting closer, and everything around me was deathly silent. No crickets or night birds, no bullfrogs croaking in high reeds or raccoons fishing for crawdads on the banks. Just deathly silence and this whistling that drew closer and closer. At this point, something primal began to wake up in me. Something that a man gets when he knows his life is in danger. Autopilot survival kicked in, and I dropped my expensive fishing gear like some sort of sacrifice and bolted towards my truck. It seemed to take ages to get the passenger side door of the cab. With every step I was sure whatever was coming towards me was going to grab me. I dared not look over my shoulder. The whistling sound had become loud to a point of almost chaos. Among the empty whistles were the loud plops and splashes of something moving through the water. It sounded like something was wading through the lake, but there's no way it was possible. Rose Lake is easily 100 feet in the center, and the thick mud and weeds in the shallower parts of the lake made wading through a slow task at best, but whatever, this was moving fast. Way faster than anything that big should be able to. After several more panic-inducing moments, I threw the door open to the cab, hurled myself in, and slammed the door behind me as quick as I could. Through my heavy breathing I could still hear the whistles. They were coming from right where I had been fishing just moments prior. As I went to start my truck and hurry away, my heart sank in horror and disbelief. "Fuck," I half whispered, half screamed as I ripped my hat off in panicked frustration. My keys were in my bag. The bag I had left beside my fishing pole in the bank of the bank. Stupid. Stupid, I whispered harshly at myself as I looked around for a miracle I knew I wasn't going to find. I was a simple hillbilly from rural Ohio. I wasn't going to hotwire anything, and I absolutely wasn't going to leave and try and get my keys. As I tried desperately to evaluate my situation, the whistling stopped. I couldn't hear anything. As my eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps sprinting towards my truck. A mad and uncontrolled sprint. I know it sounds weird to describe, but I could almost feel the insanity in the footfalls. Whatever was barreling towards me was possessed with some kind of mindless rage. Once again, primal human instinct kicked into overdrive, and when one can't fight or flee, they hide, and that's exactly what I did. I titled my seat back as far as it would go and slid down into the truck cab's floor as low as I could fit. No sooner had I done so when a series of loud bangs erupted violently against the truck. I could feel the whole vehicle rocking with the impacts. Heavy fists bashed furiously against the sides. Terrified beyond any rationale whatsoever, I threw my arms over my head and cried loudly while desperately praying to whatever God could possibly bail me out of the predicament I was in. As though I was delivered, the banging finally stopped. The hyperventilation of my fear-stricken breaths was the only sound that could be heard now. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes of absolute stillness, I finally found the courage to peek my head up. It took everything I had in me to stifle the scream that tried to escape at the sight before me. Just on the other side of the passenger's side window was a face pressed tightly against the window. So tightly that it seemed painful to achieve. At least to a normal person, but the thing pressed against my passenger's side was anything but normal. Large disc-like eyes peered into the darkness of the cabs like moons. No pupils. Just two bright discs staring emptily into the void. Its jaw was unnaturally wide in a tooth-filled grin, two small holes where a nose should be, and a mess of oily black hair hung off its head in a waterlogged fashion. As the image processed, I could make out that it wasn't hair at all. This horrible thing was covered in drapes of lake weeds. Through the slightly cracked driver's side window I could smell the sickly pungent scent of rot and decay mixed grotesquely with what I could only describe as a bottom of a lake smell. Unable to move. Paralyzed with fear. I could only gaze into the empty eyes and smile less grin as it remained pressed firmly against the window. As badly as I wanted to scream, to run, to weep, I could not make myself do anything. My mind raced with empty thoughts of pure fear and panic. Nothing real computed or processed. As I dwindled to the point of what I was sure was a total breakdown state of insanity. The creature closed its mouth abruptly, and the whistling was back. It sounded low, and far away. Like it did when it was across the lake. The horrible face peeled itself off the window and was once again lost to the darkness around me. I could hear footsteps against the dirt, slow and rhythmic. Making their way from me and back towards the lake. As this monster's footsteps grew further, the whistling grew louder. Still terrified to move, I listened as the whistles grew to an impossibly loud volume. It was like I could hear it in my head, almost feel it in my core. It sent pains through my ears that seemed to hurt my bones. It quickly became maddening and unbearable. Then just like that, as suddenly as the whistling had first started, there was once again complete silence. After a few moments of listening and shaking in my poor attempt at a hiding place, the natural sounds of nightlife in the woods returned to the world around me, and the evil horrible presence of whatever predator I had narrowly escaped diminished. It was a sleepless night and a slow morning before I finally got the courage to climb out of the truck to grab my keys. I did it in a full sprint. Tripping and sliding over everything in my stiff-boned and exhausted state. I grabbed my bag and my bag only and sprinted back to the truck, barely noticing the large dents and scrape marks along the side that had not been there the day prior. Jumping back into my seat, I hightailed it out of there. As far away from the lake as the wheels could take me. It wasn't until I was an hour or so away from Rose Lake, driving way too fast with no destination to speak of, that last night's events began to roll through my head in a more logical state. It was in the midst of these vain attempts to explain what happened that a horrible revelation came to me. The whistling got louder as it walked away. I thought to myself, slowly, almost effortfully, as if my soul was in a tug-of-war with my mind. But when I first heard it, when I thought it was across the lake, it had to have been really close. Rose Lake truly was like something out of a postcard, but now I only feel dread and nervousness when I think about it. I don't know if my father or my grandfather or his grandfather or the Iroquois would have deemed Rose Lake as scared, but for the rest of my days, I know it's cursed, and I will never go back there again. Posted by you/Saint_Circa. Cry sounds. Every year I chuckled to myself as I stooped down to harvest the handful of healthy-sized morels that had sprung out of the ground at the base of the old oak tree that stood at the top of the hill of these woods. Every year for as long as I could remember. Morel mushrooms could always be found in this spot. Always in good shape. Always a good amount. Only in the spring. It was the certainty of this annual foraging that led to the naming of this area as Morel Mound by everyone who wandered here, and in my 30-some years of walking through these woodlands I'd never heard anyone call it anything else. As I tossed the mushrooms into my bag with others I'd found, I made my way east, down the hill and worked carefully to the holler below. Head on down to Stone House, eat some lunch, smoke a cigarette, head south through the holler. I plotted to myself as I stepped absent-mindedly around the trees and over the high brushes all around me. All of them familiar. I always admired how the forest could be so dynamic yet eternally static. Nothing moves, as it always changes. After 20 minutes or so my path eventually led me to my self-designated resting spot. Stone house was exactly what it suggested. A stone house between a mess of trees. Older than anyone can remember. As stuck in time as the stones and hills it rested on. The roof had long since decayed, but the stone frame, though consumed by vines and moss, had held up considerably well. As kids my brother and I would spend hours out at Stone House playing cowboys and Indians or knights who defended their keep. As teenagers we'd camp out here and have parties with our friends, but as adults we'd simply rest out here. Eat our lunches, reminisce on the ghosts of our youth, and look forward to the days our children found the same joys here as their fathers did. Stepping through the threshold of the ruined cottage I was met with cleared dirt flooring, and at the back of the single-roomed cottage were the thrones. My brother and I as children had spent months carving 2 big chairs out of chunks of a birch tree that our father had cut down. When they were complete, and to our likings, we hauled them up the hill. One at a time and through the heavy wooden seats facing out of the single caved-in wall in that stone house had. We had built our thrones, we had fought the hill, and in our childlike minds we had earned our places as kings of the forest. The caved-in wall allowed us to survey all around our kingdom whenever we pleased, and even as adults we still found ourselves sitting on these seats, and though we knew it wasn't true. To sit in these chairs still gave me a whimsical sense of royalty. It's good to be king, I said smiling as I raised my canteen to the lands around me. The same old trees. The same old stone house. The same foolish and careless kid. Always changing, but always the same. The sun was out. The skies were clear, and God was above all, and it was with these thoughts and feelings that I lulled myself to sleep under the warm spring sun. I jolted awake with the overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. Even though my mind told me to jump out of my seat. My body, which had been slumped awkwardly in a chair for a long time, disagreed with the attempt. My tailbone and my neck were stiff and painful. As I groaned and waited for the stiffness to subside, I scanned my surroundings. The sun was low in the sky, casting giant shadows around everything. Orange and yellow could be seen painted through the trees, but everything else around me was casted as a dark silhouette. The air had grown colder, and harsh winds would occasionally break through the trees and send a shiver down my spine. It was within one of these gusts of wind that I heard something. It sounded low and drawn out. Almost like a groan of dismay. I stopped pulling myself up. Almost frozen, every sense of my being was on high alert. I listened intently into the woods ahead of me in some kind of attempt to decipher what that sound was. I listened for several more moments and rationalized that it must have just been the wind going through the trees in a strange way. I stood myself up from out of the throne and planned to make my way back up the hill and towards home. Going through the holler would take too long, and I wouldn't have enough daylight going that way. I'd barely have enough to backtrack with. As I stepped across the dirt floor I heard the voice again, louder this time, and much more obvious. Instead of fading with the wind now the voice continued. What I thought was just the wind was very quickly turning into the sound of someone crying loudly. Not just crying but wailing. At first, I thought that it must be a lost hiker, or someone in trouble, but as the wailing continued, I realized that something wasn't human about the sounds I was hearing. There was crying, but there wasn't any tearfulness is the best I can describe it. It wasn't the sound someone makes when they're crying. It was more like the sound someone might make if they were trying to sound like they were crying. Like an imitation. Petrified with sudden fear I stared wide-eyed into the trees as the cry sounds became closer and louder almost by the moment. It seemed to come from everywhere. Sometimes I was sure it was coming from the doorway, sometimes from west side of the house. Miraculously I was able to snap out of my panic enough to crouch behind the large birch seats, and attempt to hide from whatever horrible thing was heading right towards me. The cry sounds grew louder and louder, and after only a few seconds had begun to turn into cry screams. The same bland and emotionless tone in the shouts amplified to a terror-inducing level of volume. Just as I was about to scream the woods fell silent. As I listened intensely to the world around me, I was met with nothing but dead silence. Nothing. No wind, or crickets, or night birds. It's as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation to what was happening, and what was going to happen next. As I cowered in catatonically behind the thrones, I began try and plan some kind of escape. I've got to sneak away. I've got to sneak away, I shouted at myself internally. But I can't, I'll make too much noise. It'll hear me. If I run it'll catch me. My thoughts were harshly interrupted by the heavy footfalls on the other side of my hiding place. Unnaturally heavy footfalls. As if someone was dropping boulders in perfect rhythm across the forest floor. It's good to be king. The same mock voice droned emptily through the darkness. It was exactly as I had said it, but so awfully wrong. The inflectuation was the same, the words were the same, but there was no life in it. It's good to be king. Again, the voice resonated hauntingly. Whatever was copying my words was right on the other side of my hiding place. My heart banged in my chest ferociously. I wanted to scream, I wanted to weep, but I couldn't do anything. I had become a part of the stone house, fused in a whimpering mess to the dirt floor, and the vine-covered walls. It's good. Yay. The empty words ended and morphed into something else. A sound that I could only describe as death. The screams of men and women and children and animals all fused together into one monstrous, hell-like bellowing. The feelings of dread and agony that could be felt with the wailing held the same empty effect that had preceded this could still be heard as the core of all the chaos around me. My fear had become so primal, so overwhelming, and all-encompassing that my body completely disconnected from any rationale my mind might have had. Autopilot kicked in, and I could feel myself standing up and sprinting away from my hiding place and through sunset matinee of the woods, screaming at the top of my lungs and pleading to whatever might listen to save me. I sprinted madly through the forest for what felt like hours, always certain that the horrible thing was coming after me. I could feel it waiting behind every tree, waiting to grab me from under every log. At times I swore I could feel it right behind me. I ran as fast and as hard as I could. Nothing was familiar anymore, and the trees I had so absent-mindedly stepped around earlier in the day were now working against me. Cut and bruised and exhausted, I finally burst out of the tree line and into the perimeter of my yard. I could see my house. I was almost there. My glimmer of hope was quickly reinstated with the newly familiar dread when from mere feet behind me I began to hear the lifeless voice again, back to its low sobbing sounds. Looking for me in the trees. With all my remaining strength I stumbled across the yard, threw myself into the house, and slammed the door shut, locking and bolting it behind me. I fell onto the floor exhausted. Too exhausted to barricade. Too winded to try and call someone. I wasn't going anywhere. I prayed that whatever was out there didn't find me. Somehow I managed to pull myself up and plop myself onto a chair in my living room. Cautiously I turned my head right and looked out the window, and that's where I saw it. Pacing at the tree line of my dimly lit yard was the silhouette of something large and terrible. It walked on 2 hoofed feet, but irrefutably had paws where hands should be on its giant muscled arms. Atop of the creature's shoulders where its head should be a deer's skull. Antlers protruded out against the lights in the yard, huge sharp teeth could be seen jutting out of the skinless jaw. In a slow lumbering fashion, it paced around the yard. It didn't appear to be looking. It seemed like it was listening, or trying to sense, or smell something. Unable to move from my position on the chair, I could merely stare at the horrible thing and pray that it didn't see me. After what felt like an eternity, the creature stopped in its tracks and began to make the fake crying sounds again. As it did, it lumbered off into the tree line, and out of sight. After a while the cries faded into the pitch black darkness of the woods. I don't think I slept for days after that night in the woods, and when I finally did, my dreams were haunted by that horrible night. I never told anyone, because who would believe something like that? How could I tell someone about something like that? Though I've never seen or heard anything like that since. It still took me a very long time to venture back out into those woods, and I will never go to Stone House again. Sometimes in my dreams I'm running wildly through the woods trying to get away. Some nights I'm hiding behind the thrones, but then there are other nights. Nights where I'm not quick enough. Nights where it finds me. And my screams of pain and dying are added to the creature's horrible lifeless cacophony.